Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a handful of verses that have, no joke, shaped 2,000 years of history. We're looking at Matthew 16, specifically verses 13 through 20. This is the moment a fisherman makes a declaration that becomes the bedrock for a global faith. Let's get right into it. So we're stepping right into a really critical scene from the Gospel of Matthew. And the setting itself, it is just packed with symbolism. It's here, in this loaded environment, that a simple question from Jesus is about to spark a world-altering answer. Okay, so our story kicks off at a place called Caesarea Philippi. You gotta understand, this city was a major hub for two big things: Roman political power and pagan worship. This place was a real crossroads of power. First, it was named for Pan, the Greek god of the wild. It even had this cave that people literally believed was a gate to the underworld. Then it gets renamed to honor the Roman Caesar himself. So it's against this backdrop, this clash of ancient gods and imperial might, that Jesus decides to pose his question. So in verse 13, Jesus starts off with a pretty broad question. He's basically taking a poll, asking his disciples, hey, what's the word on the street? Who do people out there say that I am? And in verse 14, the disciples list off all the popular theories. People think he's a great prophet, maybe John the Baptist come back from the dead. They definitely recognize he has divine power, but they're missing the full picture. And that's probably because they were expecting some kind of military messiah to overthrow Rome, not a spiritual one. And this is where Jesus pivots. He turns the question away from the crowd and points it right at his own inner circle. He's about to make it very, very personal. This brings us to the absolute heart of the matter in verse 15. Jesus makes it personal. It's not about what other people think anymore. He's asking them, who do you say I am? He wants their own conviction. And boom, in verse 16, Simon Peter steps up and delivers this incredibly bold declaration. He doesn't just say he's a prophet. No, he identifies him as the Christ, the Son of the living God. That is a massive leap beyond what anyone else was saying. Right away in verse 17, Jesus makes a really important clarification. He says, look, this profound insight you just had, that wasn't just you being clever. That wasn't a human conclusion. This was a direct revelation from God the Father. And that divine revelation, well, it becomes the launchpad for one of the most significant and, let's be honest, debated statements in the entire New Testament. Now we get to verse 18. This is where Jesus responds with that famous play on Peter's name and makes this foundational promise. But this, of course, raises the huge question, what or who is the rock? The answer to that question has been a major point of theological discussion for, centuries. And it all comes down to a subtle but absolutely crucial distinction in the original Greek text. So the key is hidden in the original Greek. Jesus calls Peter Petros, which means a single stone, a piece of rock. But he says he will build his church upon this Petra, a different word that means a massive, unmovable bedrock, like a cliff face. That little distinction is the root of all the different interpretations we still see today. So how do people understand this bedrock? Well, as you can see, different traditions see it very differently. The Catholic view is that the rock is Peter himself, making him the first pope. The Latter-day Saint perspective says the rock is actually the principle of divine revelation itself. And many Protestant traditions believe the rock is Peter's confession of faith, or maybe even Christ himself. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He keeps going, giving Peter a unique and really powerful form of authority. And he symbolizes it with a set of keys. In verse 19, Jesus gives this very specific kind of authority, symbolized by the keys of the kingdom. This includes the power to bind and loose, which suggests that decisions made on earth under this authority are actually backed up or ratified in heaven. This whole thing really illustrates the concept of delegated authority. So in this context, to bind could mean forbidding an action or maybe sealing a covenant. And to loose could mean permitting something or even granting forgiveness. The main idea here is that these earthly actions are upheld by divine power. And just like the rock, the meaning of the keys is another point where interpretations diverge. The Catholic view sees it as Peter's unique authority to lead the church. The Latter-day Saint view connects it to priesthood authority for things like sealing ordinances. And many Protestant views see it as the authority given to all believers to go out and preach the gospel. Now, right after this huge monumental revelation and granting of authority, Jesus does something completely unexpected. He gives up, well, a pretty surprising command. In the very last verse of our passage, verse 20, Jesus does something you wouldn't expect. Right at the peak of this incredible revelation, he commands silence. So why? Why, after this amazing confirmation, would he demand secrecy? Well, the reasons were strategic. The public was geared up for a political king, someone to overthrow Rome. Announcing himself as the Messiah right then would have likely kicked off a violent but totally misguided uprising. Plus, even the disciples didn't fully get his real mission yet. So it really was all about divine timing, making sure his spiritual work wasn't derailed by earthly expectations before the time was right. So in this short but incredibly powerful moment, an identity is revealed, a foundation gets named, and a mission gets made clear. This whole exchange at Caesarea Philippi really marks a pivot in Jesus' ministry, turning the focus toward his final journey to Jerusalem and ultimately the cross. And that leaves us with a question that kind of echoes Jesus' own. What is the bedrock of your own understanding? In a world filled with competing claims, this passage really challenges us to think about whether our beliefs are just built on what's popular or on a foundation we've claimed for ourselves.